The morning after the inspection, we marched on Lawrence, where we expected a sharp fight, which we were fully confident of winning. My company again acted as the advance guard, and when, about midday, we reached Mount Oread, a strongly fortified position on which several guns were mounted, covering the approach to the town. Great was our surprise to find it had been evacuated. As soon as our general received the report, he ordered our company to make a wide circuit around the town, to seize the fords of the Kansas River and hold the road leading east. Hi, my name is Bill Coughlin and host the First Person Civil War podcast. The Civil War began in 1861, but unrest was brewing before the first shot was fired. Out in the Kansas Territory from 1854 to 1859, the question of whether the territory should be admitted to the Union as a slave or free state boiled over into violence, which ranged from raids to even murders. Follow me as I reveal what one man witnessed in the conflict known today as Bleeding Kansas. Episode 58 is entitled Sergeant Robert H. Williams and Atchison's Border Ruffians at the 1856 sacking of Lawrence, Kansas, and relies on his book, With the Border Ruffians, Memoirs of the Far West, 1852 to 1868, which he published in 1902. Robert Hamilton Williams was born in Whately, England, in the summer of 1831. As a child, he wanted to leave his home for military service in the British Army or the Royal Navy. Though vague on the details, Robert Williams went on a voyage to India when he was 17, but then gave it up and returned to England, where he served as a sailor on a cargo ship out of Liverpool. While the ship was in Peru taking on guano, he deserted his post, intent on sailing to California to participate in the gold rush. But he ultimately failed and returned to England. He then joined a crew which sailed to Australia and back, before finally deciding to travel to the United States to seek his fortune. Robert Williams arrived at City Point, Virginia in February 1852, and by 1854 had already owned and sold a farm in that state. Part of the payment for his farm included 3 slaves, and the rest in cash. Now a slave owner, Robert decided to move out west to settle in the Kansas Territory. By February of 1854, Robert was in St. Louis and decided to leave his slaves in that city and travel alone to Independence, Missouri. In this scene of seething unrest and wild passion, a stranger was naturally regarded with suspicion until he declared his sympathies. Mine were strongly on the side of the South, and, as soon as I made this known, I was heartily welcomed among the Border Ruffians, as the Pro-Slavery Party was nicknamed by the Free Staters. In 1854, the United States Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed settlers to move into these territories. A key component to the act was it left the question of whether a territory should enter the Union as a slave or free state up to the residents themselves, also known as popular sovereignty. This new approach would see its first application in the Kansas Territory. Pro-slavery and free state settlers began to move into the territory while financial aid and weapons flowed in as well. As settlers spread across the territory, towns like Lawrence, Osawatomie, and Topeka became centers of the Free State movement, while Lecompton, Atchison, Leavenworth, and other towns supported pro-slavery efforts. Robert Williams eventually crossed the Missouri River and settled in the town of Leavenworth, just outside the adjacent U.S. Army fort, and went into a business deal with a man from Kentucky. He built a house in the town, brought his slaves from St. Louis and was intent on buying plots of land to resell to incoming settlers. Leavenworth was a key location in many respects, but critical to Free State efforts was that it provided a means to cross the Missouri River into the Kansas Territory. The pro-slavery citizens of Leavenworth recognized their unique position, and men like Robert Williams took steps to hamper Free Staters as they crossed the river. To stop the influx of men and arms from the north into Leavenworth, which was the only easily accessible port of entry for them, a Minute Company, so called for its brief period of service, was formed to search every boat, more especially for arms. I joined this company, and I remember we seized a great number of rifles, some of them Sharp's breech loaders, 2 of which were given to me. Tensions would only increase with the 1855 territorial elections, which were rife with voter fraud, as witnessed by Robert Williams. Now the elections of the territorial legislature came on, and, considered as elections, were of course a farce. In many places, Missourians and Southerners seized the polls and crammed the ballot boxes. In others, Free Soilers did the same. The result was that 2 legislatures were elected, the pro-slavery one making its capital in Lecompton, and the Free State one at Topeka. The rival parties met at the polls and elsewhere, and many lives were lost in the fighting that took place. With the territorial capital of Lecompton approximately 15 miles away from the Free State-leaning Lawrence, tensions, especially in that region, began to flare in the wake of the 1855 election. The first major incident that included organized bands of border ruffians and Free Staters was known as the Wakarusa War of late 1855, which was sparked by the murder of a Free Stater by the name of Charles Dow at the hands of a pro-slavery settler named Franklin Coleman. The war culminated in a siege of Lawrence, where border ruffians and Free State militia faced down each other, but ended in a truce. An incident that occurred during the Wakarusa War, which was also important to the sacking of Lawrence, was the arrest of Jacob Branson in late November 1855. The pro-slavery county sheriff, Samuel Jones, arrested Branson under the charge of disturbing the peace, when all he did was transport the remains of his friend, Charles Dow, to his house. Samuel Wood, who was a lawyer and had investigated the murder, organized a posse and rescued Jacob Branson from Sheriff Jones's custody before he arrived at Lecompton. On 19 April 1856, Sheriff Jones rode into Lawrence to arrest Samuel Wood for rescuing Jacob Branson. The sheriff found Samuel Wood in the town and attempted to arrest him. However, he did not recognize the authority of the pro-slavery government that appointed the sheriff and refused arrest. Jones then tried to seek support from the citizens of Lawrence to conduct the arrest, but he was unsuccessful and Samuel Wood departed. Critical to the sheriff's first attempt was that he had no formal arrest warrant, but received it the next day. Sheriff Jones rode back to Lawrence accompanied by 6 U.S. cavalrymen intent on arresting Samuel Wood. But on the evening of his arrival, he was shot in the back in his own tent by an unknown man and partially paralyzed for the rest of his life. The shooting of Sheriff Jones made headlines, especially in Southern newspapers, which initially reported that he had been murdered in Lawrence. Though these newspapers eventually corrected the error, Robert Williams does not remember this fact. The excitable Southerner's blood was nearly at boiling point when Sheriff Jones, elected by them, was shot dead by a Free Soiler in the execution of his duty. Then it boiled over, and the fight became general. Though already aiding pro-slavery efforts like inspecting river cargo around Leavenworth, Robert Williams decided to join a company of border ruffians. Fully resolved to throw in my lot with the South, I now joined a company of mounted rangers, raised by A.B. Miller, who, though a professional gambler, had the reputation of a plucky fighting man, and was at once elected orderly sergeant myself. No oath of enlistment was taken, but there was no fear of desertion or insubordination, since death would have been the penalty for either crime. The U.S. Marshal of the Kansas Territory expected that any further attempts to execute arrests within Lawrence would be met with force, and issued the following proclamation on 11 May, which summed up the incident and called for action. As there is every reason to believe that any attempt to execute these rights will be resisted by a large body of armed men, now, therefore, the law-abiding citizens of the territory are commanded to be and appear at Lecompton as soon as practicable, and in numbers sufficient for proper execution of the law. Bands of border ruffians began to converge upon Lecompton, and Sergeant Williams and the mounted rangers fell under the command of David Rice Atchison. Hailing from Missouri, he served as a major general of militia during the Missouri Mormon War, and as a senator of the state of Missouri had supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act and expected Kansas to enter the Union as a slave state. During this time, Sergeant Williams met David Atchison and held him in high esteem. Our commander was General Davy Atchison, a well-known and influential character in those parts. A lawyer by profession, he was also a planter and a large slave owner, consequently thoroughly sound on the goose. With a somewhat rough exterior, he was really a kindly man, and being "hail fellow, well met" with all his supporters, was, as I have said, extremely popular. Sergeant Williams does not say how many days the mounted rangers camped around Lecompton before they marched on Lawrence, but in the meantime, they were tasked with guarding the nearby Kansas River. Life in camp was pleasant enough at first, for our general didn't go in for drill, possibly because he didn't know much about it himself, and our principal duty was to keep watch and ward over the river and stop all passing steamboats to search them for free soilers and their arms. Those that did not stop when ordered were promptly brought to by a field battery we had posted on the river, commanding the passage. All suspected Free Staters were taken out and kept under guard, and, of course, all their arms were confiscated. The Free Staters in Lawrence and the surrounding region noticed the buildup of border ruffians around Lecompton, and several hundred Free State men formed in Lawrence ready to resist. A Samuel C. Pomeroy persuaded these men to stand down, and reasoned that it would be best for the town to be raided than trying to resist it. Pomeroy was a member of the New England Immigrant Aid Company, which funded abolitionist settlers in Kansas, and was pivotal in the founding of Lawrence itself. Resolved not to resist the border ruffians, they made appeals to Territorial Governor Wilson Shannon in Lecompton to intervene. These appeals were ignored, as Governor Shannon even inspected Sergeant Williams and his fellow border ruffians. The next morning, which was 20 May, Governor Shannon, our own party's governor, paid us a visit of inspection and was pleased to express his high approval of our discipline and workmanlike appearance. The next day, 21 May, Sergeant Williams and the border ruffians marched on Lawrence. Before they entered the town, Senator Atchison made an impassioned speech to the men. Arresting Free Staters was now only one part of the march upon Lawrence. They would also target the apparatus that supported Free State efforts, which were the printing presses and the Free State Hotel, which new settlers often used before traveling further west. Of the many perspectives of this long speech, one was given by Dr. Joseph Root, a Free Stater who was already under arrest. Gentlemen, officers, and soldiers, This is the most glorious day of my life. This is the day I am a border ruffian. The U.S. Marshal has just given you his orders and has kindly invited me to address you. You have endured many hardships, have suffered many privations on your trips. But for this, you will be more than compensated by the work laid out by the Marshal, and what you know is to be done as the program of the day. Now, boys, let your work be well done. Faint not as you approach the city of Lawrence, but remembering your mission. Act with true Southern heroism, and, at the word, spring like the bloodhounds at home upon that damned accursed abolition hole. Break through everything that may oppose your never-flinching courage. Yes, ruffians, draw your revolvers and bowie knives, and cool them in the heart's blood of all those damned dogs that dare defend the damned breathing hole of hell. Tear down their boasted Free State Hotel, and if those hellish lying free soilers have left no portholes in it, with your unerring cannon, make some. Yes, riddle it till it shall fall to the ground. Throw into the Kansas their printing presses, and let's see if any more free speeches will be issued from them. Sergeant Williams does not mention Atchison's speech, but he and his fellow border ruffians were in high spirits as they marched into town. The morning after the inspection, we marched on Lawrence, where we expected a sharp fight, which we were fully confident of winning. My company again acted as the advance guard, and when, about midday, we reached Mount Oread, a strongly fortified position on which several guns were mounted, covering the approach to the town. Great was our surprise to find it had been evacuated. As soon as our general received the report, he ordered our company to make a wide circuit around the town, to seize the fords of the Kansas River and hold the road leading east. The residents of Lawrence showed no resistance to the border ruffians when they rode in around 5 p.m., and with the town surrounded, they went to work destroying the printing presses and the hotel. Sheriff Jones, who was well enough to accompany the border ruffians alongside Senator Atchison, ordered 4 artillery pieces aimed at the Free State Hotel, while the owners attempted to remove anything they could from the building. The ruffians fired somewhere between 12 and 50 shells at the hotel, which had little effect, and ultimately burned the building to the ground. One of the detachments of ruffians was under the command of Henry Titus of Lecompton, who ordered the firing of the hotel. Once it was in flames, he led his men through the streets, looting any citizens and homes they came across. Titus was in such a fervor that he desired the destruction of the entire town, but it was blocked by other ruffian leaders who did not want destruction of private property. As the sacking of Lawrence continued, many citizens evacuated the town on the road leading east toward the Kansas River. They were met by Sergeant Williams and the mounted rangers. No doubt his men were not keen of fighting, being the riffraff of the northern towns enlisted by the Immigrants' Aid Society, and most of them quite unused to bearing arms of any kind. Many of them bolted for the Kansas River ford on the eastern road, and we of Miller's company took quite 3 times of our own number of these valiant warriors prisoners. I well remember how scared the poor wretches were. I am glad to say that the prisoners' lives were spared, all but 2, and they were hanged by the provost marshal for horse stealing, the penalty for which was invariably death in that western country, even in ordinary times. The sacking of Lawrence ended that evening, and by midnight, Sergeant Williams and the mounted rangers rode back to Lecompton to report to Governor Shannon on the outcome of the march upon the town. Damage to property in Lawrence was high, but more importantly, blood had been spilled. 2 Free Staters were killed. 1 border ruffian died from the Free State Hotel's collapse, and another ruffian was wounded when he accidentally shot himself. In the wake of the sacking of Lawrence, bands of border ruffians and Free Staters became commonplace, and the violence escalated, as witnessed by Sergeant Williams. In these operations, we occupied Topeka. This is in reference to the dispersal of the Free State government in July 1856, and had a brush with a body of Northerners under Jim Lane, in which we lost 2 men killed and 6 wounded. Next, at Lone Jack, we had a skirmish with Captain John Brown's men, but the fighting was at long range, and no harm was done, for the Free Staters soon retired, and we were not strong enough to follow them up. On the march, the day after this, to Sugar Creek, and whilst scouting ahead of the company with 2 other men, I came on the bodies of 2 young men lying close together, both shot through the head. The murdered men, for it was brutal murder and nothing else, were dressed like Yankee mechanics, and apparently had been done to death the previous night. The violence of Bleeding Kansas would continue until the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. An abolitionist that Sergeant Williams faced in Kansas, John Brown, was so intent on freeing slaves that he left the fighting in Kansas and attempted to start a slave revolt in the southern states. In mid-October 1859, his men occupied the U.S. Arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, with the intent of marching south to arm slaves. In this, John Brown failed and was sentenced to hang for treason against the state of Virginia. Despite this fighting, the Free State movement gained a majority, and the Kansas Territory sought admission to the Union as a free state, but was blocked by the U.S. Senate. As Southern states seceded from the Union, the deadlock in Congress was alleviated when senators departed Washington, D.C. for the Confederacy. In January 1861, Kansas entered the Union as a free state. While the vast majority of the Civil War was fought to the east of Kansas, it was still seen to intense violence such as the Lawrence Massacre, where William Quantrill, leader of a Confederate guerrilla group, led an attack on the city, which resulted in the deaths of 164 people. Robert Williams remained with the Border Ruffians until 1860 and eventually left Kansas as a direct result of his actions. Sergeant Williams had a few run-ins with a Free Stater known as Klein, who on one occasion attempted to hang him for the charge of being a border ruffian. Williams eventually shot Klein while attempting to arrest him for horse stealing, but did not kill him. When Klein recovered and returned to Kansas, he vowed vengeance and got an arrest warrant for Robert Williams for his actions as a border ruffian. Robert Williams recognized the political changes in Kansas in favor of Free Staters, and that staying was no longer an option. He summed up the violence of Bleeding Kansas in this manner. I may say at once that, though we did a deal of marching and counter-marching, and though on several occasions a general engagement between the opposing forces seemed imminent, it never came to a pitched battle, and all the many lives that were lost in this miserable border fighting were lost in small affairs between scouting parties and outposts. Many men, too, on either side, were killed in this way to pay out old scores and gratify private spite and revenge. Upon the outbreak of the Civil War, Robert Williams was outside of San Antonio, Texas, and decided to fight for the Confederacy. He joined Dunn's company of partisan rangers and hoped to march to Virginia and fight under General Lee or Jackson, but ultimately stayed in Texas. Following the war, Robert Williams returned to his family home in England, where he published his memoirs in 1908. Thank you for listening to the 58th episode. The link to Sergeant Williams's book is now available on the podcast website, firstpersoncivilwarpodcast.com. On Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn this week, you will find a picture of Robert Williams just a few years before he died. To attend to a personal matter, I will need 3 weeks to complete this next episode. Thank you for your understanding. On 11 February, Private Joseph J. Sutton of Company H, 2nd West Virginia Cavalry, provides next episode's first-person account at the Battle of Five Forks. My name is Bill Coughlin, and thank you for listening to First Person Civil War Podcast.